Have you ever felt that emptiness, even when it seemed like you had everything? You wake up every day, go to work, pay the bills, and suddenly, the silent question hits you: who am I, really, behind all of this? It's a pain we learn to silence. A pain that concerns our freedom. Because most of us have been taught that freedom is synonymous with vacation, money, or power, that it's the direct path to happiness. But what if I told you that the greatest existential psychologist of the 20th century, Rollo May, disagreed? May warns us of a hard truth to swallow: freedom is not happiness. On the contrary, he says it is something far more terrible and powerful. Terrible because it forces us to confront the abyss of our own lives. Today, we'll delve into Elara's story. A woman who, like many of us, lost everything only to finally find the most terrifying and powerful thing that exists: herself. Her journey of abandonment is proof that our greatest strength lies in the courage to face the anguish of choice. If you've ever felt abandoned by life, or by yourself, get ready. This story is the map to your own awakening. And now we're going to Elara's story and the true nature of freedom, but first, just make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, because the next videos will be a series of content that will help you have unwavering mental and emotional health. Elara was living what she honestly believed to be the life of her dreams. Not because of extravagant luxury, but because of that warm feeling that everything was under control. She and Kaio had built a routine as predictable as the sunrise: the same Friday dinners, the same July vacations, the same smell of coffee in his favorite mug. Kaio was responsible for all the big decisions. Where to invest, which car to buy, even what the theme of the living room decor would be. And for Elara, that was the definition of security and love. She didn't realize it, but she had traded her ability to choose for the comfort of dependence. This dependence was like a mother-of-pearl shell, beautiful on the outside, but preventing her from growing. She didn't need to confront the world, because Kaio was her shield. She didn't need to develop her own radical opinions or take risks, because he had already calculated everything. In the eyes of society, Elara was successful. She was Kaio's wife, and that was her primary identity. This delegation of her freedom was subtle, silent, but fatal to her soul. She was living a life in the third person, where the protagonist was, in fact, the shadow of the other's desire. Think about it: how many times do we, as adults, give up our own freedom in exchange for a false sense of security? Elara found herself in her 40s with a resume as a caregiver and home manager, but without an intrinsic sense of purpose. She had free time, yes, but it was always filled with activities that revolved around Kaio's world, not her own. Her hobbies were the ones he approved of, her friendships were, for the most part, his contacts. She had the illusion of control, but she was completely tied down. This dynamic wasn't malicious, it was simply the reflection of a tacit agreement: you give me stability, and I give you my autonomy. And for Rollo May, this is the most dangerous trap of modern life. Where the anxiety of freedom, the fear of failing when choosing, leads us to shrink into gilded cages, created by ourselves. Elara lived inside one of these cages, admired by those who looked from the outside, but increasingly suffocated inside. With each decision she failed to make, a part of her true essence atrophied, like a muscle that is not used. She felt safe, yes, but at a terrible cost: the loss of herself. She didn't need to fight, she didn't need to question, and the result was a life free from major turbulence, but also free from authentic passion. She was a supporting character in her own story. The fear of facing the world alone and responsibly was much greater than the frustration of being invisible to herself. This was the happiness she sought, the absence of pain and risk, what May would describe as a neurosis of conformity. And it is precisely here, at this point of apparent calm and total dependence, that Elara's story of freedom must begin. Because only when the shell breaks, when the pillar collapses, are we forced to confront the raw and terrifying force of what it truly means to exist on our own. She was on the edge of a precipice, without knowing it. The comfort she so cherished was about to transform into the most terrifying, yet also most liberating, void she would ever experience. Security was about to give way to courage. Absolutely. Let's continue Elara's captivating and profound story, following the 20 topics and incorporating her CTAs at the right time. Elara's abandonment didn't come like a thunderclap, but like a fog that creeps in stealthily. There was no fight, slammed door, or cutting words that could be recounted in a future divorce. The abandonment was a process of emptying. Kaio began taking increasingly longer business trips, offering increasingly generic excuses for not answering the phone, and, most painful of all, an emotional silence that filled the house like an odorless, suffocating gas. It was a presence that was becoming an absence, but one that stubbornly clung to the facade of normality. This kind of abandonment, the silence and gradual disappearance, is what May would make us reflect on regarding the anxiety of uncertainty. Elara couldn't react to anger because there was no anger to confront, there was only the rarefied air of doubt. She checked the mailbox, the bank statement, and each day, the evidence of Kaio's life became scarcer. The trauma wasn't the breakup itself, but the slow and agonizing realization that the reality she inhabited was dissolving, without a clear breaking point to cling to. She was falling, but there was no ground to hit. Then came the day when the silence became literal and final. Kaio's place at the dinner table, which had previously been occasionally empty due to work, became chronically empty. And, along with his absence, came the cold revelation, the joint accounts were almost empty, and a large part of the assets had already been discreetly transferred. There was no farewell, only the evidence of a planned escape. The abandonment was not a mistake, it was a unilateral choice he made, leaving her with the inheritance of his debts and, more importantly, with existential emptiness. Elara was forced to confront the reality that the man she loved had treated her as an extension of his life, not as an individual being. And, in leaving, he took with him the license she had given him to be his own freedom. Kaio's absence not only took away her partner, it took away the meaning she had built for her dependent life. This emptiness, this lack of response, was far worse than any argument. For adults who have experienced loss or disappointment, this subtle abandonment is deeply relatable. It doesn't have to be a grand betrayal, simply feel the ground disappear beneath your feet without warning. The pain wasn't just the pain of lost love, but the pain of realizing that security was an illusion. This brutal emptiness confronted her with the one thing she had avoided for years, the total responsibility for her own survival and identity. From that moment on, Elara lived in an echo chamber. Where there had been conversation, there was now silence. Where there had been financial support, there were now negative statements. And this emptiness was the invitation, both frightening and compelling, for her to finally create something new. The trauma wasn't the end of a relationship, it was the forced beginning of her own autonomous existence. The silent abandonment was the cruel engine of her liberation. The house where Elara lived had ceased to be a home and had become a museum of absences. Of all the rooms, it was the dining table that resonated with abandonment most cruelly. That chair of Kaio's, at the end, permanently unoccupied, had become the physical symbol of her crumbling structure. It wasn't just an empty chair, it was the space where her safety, her routine, and, by extension, her identity, used to reside. Every morning, as she passed through the living room, she felt the weight of that empty chair, as if it were an invisible anchor. This empty chair represented what Rollo May calls the loss of established Dacian, the being there, in the world. Elara's world had been taken from her, and now she sat on the edge of an abyss. The anguish did not stem from a lack of companionship, but from a lack of structure and meaning. She no longer knew how to behave, what to expect, or where to go, because the compass she used was in Kaio's hand. This empty chair was a cold mirror, reflecting not the absence of someone, but the absence of herself. She tried to escape. She ate at the counter, watched TV in bed, but the image of the table, large and silent, pulled her back. It was impossible to ignore. This daily confrontation was the first stage of awakening. Existential anguish forced her to recognize that she was no longer defined by her role as a wife, but rather by the emptiness that remained. It was a moment of terror, because emptiness is an invitation to nothingness, to the total disintegration of being. For its audience, who understand the weight of everyday symbols, Empty Chair is powerful. It touches on the vulnerability of depending on something external to feel complete. Elara, during that period, felt smaller, almost transparent. Her voice seemed lower. She moved through the house like a stranger, observing the furniture that was no longer theirs, but only hers, and the weight of ownership and responsibility crushed her. The struggle against the empty chair was, in reality, a struggle to reclaim that space for herself. To say, "All right, you're empty. Now, who's going to sit here and take the reins?" However, this question was paralyzing. She spent hours just observing the table, feeling the immensity of the task of rebuilding herself from scratch. The empty chair was, therefore, her first and most powerful teacher, teaching her the harsh lesson that external security is always temporary. Ultimately, the emptiness of that chair prepared her for May's central truth: freedom is the recognition that we are the authors of our own being, and this authorship begins the moment all crutches are removed. The empty chair cried out for a new occupant, one who would not be Kaio's wife, but rather Elara, the existent. And this cry was anguish in its purest form, but also the promise of a terrible power about to be born. The silence of abandonment brought with it the most devastating question: who am I without Kaio? Elara, at 40, an age when most people feel they are settled, found herself in a total identity crisis. She tried to list her attributes: wife, elegant homemaker, organizer of social events. But, with Kaio gone, all those titles fell on deaf ears. She was, in fact, a blank sheet of paper, and the fear of filling it was overwhelming. This is the confrontation with non-being, a central concept in Rollo May. Non-being doesn't necessarily mean death, but rather the loss of relevance, the dissolution of one's form in the world. Elara felt that if she weren't his wife, she would be nobody. The fear of becoming invisible, irrelevant, fueled her anguish. She realized she had lived her whole life investing in a borrowed identity, and now the lender had vanished, leaving her in existential bankruptcy. She rummaged through photo albums and boxes of belongings, searching for clues about the bold Elara, the girl who had her own dreams before meeting Kaio. But the young woman seemed like a stranger, a distant character with whom she could no longer connect. The identity crisis was the pain of having to invent herself in middle age, without an instruction manual or a social guide on how to do it. The terror was that, in reinventing herself, she might fail, and that failure would definitively lead her to non-being. Many people over 30 will identify with this feeling. The moment when a stable career, marriage, or motherhood no longer define who you are, and the need for a new purpose becomes urgent. Elara felt like a ghost in her own home. She looked in the mirror and saw a familiar face, but behind those eyes, there was no recognition. It was as if her soul was in quarantine, waiting for permission to exist again. The solution to non-being, according to May, is the act of being. It takes courage to affirm one's own existence. But for Elara, this act seemed unattainable. She was trapped in the paralysis of choice. If she chose a new path, she would be denying the past. If she chose to remain still, she would be denying the future. This painful crossroads was the core of her crisis. However, the pressure of the void was so intense that it would paradoxically become her greatest driving force. The identity crisis was the birthing process of a new Elara. Kaio's abandonment not only freed her from him but condemned her to the freedom of defining herself. True freedom is terrifying because it forces us to make this fundamental choice: to be or not to be, to act or to be paralyzed. And Elara was about to discover that the only way out was to be. Like anyone experiencing existential shock, Elara plunged into the denial phase. Instead of facing the Herculean task of rebuilding herself, she desperately tried to plug the void. She threw herself into a whirlwind of activities and rampant consumerism. She bought expensive clothes she would never wear, signed up for gyms she didn't attend, and filled her schedule with rushed and superficial friendships. The goal wasn't to connect, but simply to avoid the dreaded moment of being alone with herself. This escape, this search for palliatives, is the mechanism that Rollo May identifies as the refusal to accept solitude and the anxiety inherent in freedom. She didn't want to feel the pain of emptiness. She wanted instant fulfillment. Wine, social media, banal conversations, everything was a potent analgesic against the responsibility of existing. She feared that if she stopped running, the silence of non-being would swallow her whole. She had become unbearable company for herself, and this denial made her feverish. She talked too much, laughed too loudly, and her eyes were always restless, searching for a distraction. New friendships, noticing her neediness, either distanced themselves or exploited her. She was investing in external connections to heal an internal wound, and this only deepened her existential loneliness. She was surrounded by people, but she had never been so alone. Older audiences understand the cycle of denial well. It's the purchase we didn't need, the party we didn't want to go to, the addiction that momentarily calms us. It's the attempt to escape the reality that freedom imposes on us. Elara hoped that if she made enough noise, the echo of the empty chair would disappear, but it would only get louder. Gradually, however, the palliatives began to fail. The wine gave her headaches. Conversations left her exhausted. Consumption only brought more debt, reminding her of her precarious situation. Denial was wearing thin, and the pain, which had only been pushed down, returned with redoubled force. She was on the verge of physical and emotional exhaustion. There came a point where she had to face the futility of her escape. Emptiness was her only constant and faithful companion. And it was in this exhaustion, at the bottom of the well of denial, that true change began to take shape. She needed to stop running from the emptiness and start facing it as the starting point. The denial phase was ending to give way to the courage to be. The turning point wasn't an external event, but a silent act. Elara stopped in front of the bathroom mirror. Not to put on makeup or fix her hair, but to truly look at who was there. And what she saw wasn't sadness, anger, or guilt. She saw pure fear, etched in their eyes. A fear not of thieves or illness, but the fear of existing without guarantees. This is the crucial moment where neurotic anxiety, irrational and avoidable fear, transforms into existential anxiety, the fear inherent in life and freedom. She recognized that the real fear was not of becoming poor or alone, but the fear of having to decide, every day, who she would be. It was the dread of unused freedom, the potential that lay dormant and that now, forcibly, had to awaken. She saw that his face was tense, his shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she understood that Kaio's abandonment hadn't caused her suffering, it had only revealed the fear she had always carried, that of being solely responsible for her destiny. This revelation was terrible, for it implied that the happiness of years past was an illusion built upon escaping that very responsibility. For the adult audience, this is the moment of deepest self-identification. It's when we realize that we are the ones paralyzing ourselves, not the circumstances. Elara broke down in tears, not from sadness, but from truth. She was confronting her own limitation, her lack of ontological courage, the courage to be who she is. Looking at her fear in the mirror, she made a fundamental, albeit unconscious, choice, not to run away anymore. The fear was there, but she didn't look away. She named it. She accepted it as part of her new reality. This acceptance of anxiety, according to May, is the first step towards authentic freedom. You don't eliminate fear, you act despite it. The lasting image is of Elara sitting on the cold bathroom floor, the fogged mirror reflecting only the silhouette of a woman who had finally stopped running. She was on the threshold. The fear, once paralyzing, now served as a compass. It pointed to where she needed to go, in the opposite direction from her comfort zone, towards conscious action. The mirror of fear was the catalyst that transformed despair into dignity. Having overcome the shock of denial, Elara entered the existential anguish phase. She realized the truth, the freedom that Kaio had unintentionally bequeathed to her was not a joyful gift. It wasn't what you see in movies, with open landscapes and easy smiles. It was a terrible responsibility. Every time she woke up, she had to choose to be. She could no longer blame Kaio or the circumstances, the pen was in her hand. This anguish, as explained by May, is the dizzying sensation we feel when contemplating the infinite possibilities and, at the same time, the certainty that choosing one excludes all others. If she chose to be a businesswoman, she would no longer be a housewife. If she chose to travel, she would no longer be putting down roots. The weight of being the sole author of her own life was overwhelming. The pain of this phase is the loneliness of the decision. No one could choose for her. She could ask for advice, but the final responsibility was solely hers. And the audience over 30, dealing with mortgages, children, established careers, understands how heavy that responsibility is. Elara understood that freedom is not about doing what you want, but about choosing what you should be. She spent sleepless nights listing the pros and cons of seemingly trivial options, selling the house, moving to another city, going back to school. But for her, each item on the list was a fundamental choice that would shape her future and define her being. The anguish was the price of her humanity. It was the recognition that her life was not predetermined, it was a work in perpetual progress. It was during this period that she stopped seeking happiness as an end goal. She understood that happiness is a volatile byproduct of life, but freedom is the foundation. And the foundation is solid, but it demands constant work and acceptance of pain. Anguish was teaching her the courage to be imperfect, to try and fail, but to keep choosing. The awakening of anguish was Elara's baptism of fire. She ceased being a victim and became an existent being. She accepted that life would not be easy, but that it would ultimately be hers. This transformative realization freed her from the illusory pursuit of a permanent state of contentment and led her to embrace the journey, with all its turbulence and power. Anguish drove her to action. Elara's first great act of freedom was the decision to sell the house. That large house, once seen as a trophy of marital success, had become a prison home. Every corner, every piece of furniture, screamed Kaio's name and reminded her of her former dependent identity. The house was an anchor that tied her to a past that no longer existed. The act of making the decision, calling the real estate agent, and signing the papers for the sale was the first cry of freedom. It was an act of transcendence, the movement of going beyond immediate circumstances to create a future. It wasn't easy. She cried while packing the photos, felt fear thinking about where she would live next, but the strength of this choice came from the certainty that, to be reborn, she needed to kill the past. Putting up the "for sale" sign in front of the property was the first public sign that Elara was taking control. This action wasn't about money, it was about existential space. She was giving up comfort and memory in exchange for possibility. This attitude resonates deeply with May's philosophy: freedom is always an act of building upon the destruction of what limited us. This decision generated a tsunami of questions and external judgments, which brings us to the next topic. But Elara was shielded. The weight of her own anguish was greater than the opinions of others. She was acting from her authentic self, and this gave her a strength she never knew she possessed. The act of selling the house was an affirmation that she was more than the sum of her possessions or her memories. The money from the sale represented her new responsibility. No longer a safety net for the couple, but the initial capital for her own reinvention. She was trading brick walls for opportunities. That first cry of freedom, though frightening, was the point of no return. Elara had chosen courage over comfort, power over security. The house was sold. Elara said goodbye to each room, but felt immense relief. She wasn't losing a home, she was gaining a future. This first major move proved that freedom is not a feeling, but a concrete action that demands sacrifice and confrontation. As soon as the "for sale" sign was installed, social judgment fell upon Elara. Friends, neighbors, and even relatives came with unsolicited advice, all disguised as concern. "Are you crazy? Wait for Kaio to come back, women our age don't take risks like that." The world seemed to conspire to force her back into her previous comfort zone, that shell of dependency. For Rollo May, social conformity is one of the greatest enemies of freedom. The people around Elara weren't concerned with her, but rather with the disruption her decision caused in their own comfort zones. If Elara stood up for herself, it would force others to question their own self-imposed prisons. The social judgment was a reflection of the collective fear of freedom. They tried to use guilt and shame as weapons. They tried to convince her that her anguish was an illness to be cured, not a sign of awakening. They said she should seek the happiness of a new marriage or an easy job, denying her the right to seek something deeper and more difficult. The pressure was enormous. However, the anguish she had embraced, topic 7, had shielded her. The weight of her own existential responsibility was now greater than the lightness of others' opinions. She finally realized that people were seeing her through the lens of who they wanted her to be, not who she was becoming. She began to respond with short, firm phrases, establishing emotional boundaries. This phase is crucial for the adult audience, who constantly deal with the expectations of parents, children, and spouses. Social judgment reminds us that authentic freedom will always involve the disapproval of those who benefited from our dependence. Elara learned that external approval is the enemy of self-affirmation. She distanced herself from those who tried to belittle her. Social judgment, instead of paralyzing her, served as a filter. She kept only the people who respected her courage, even if they didn't understand her choice. The cost of freedom is the solitude in decision-making, but the benefit is integrity. Elara had chosen her own truth over the comfort of the herd. After overcoming the initial judgment and anguish, Elara arrived at the synthesis: courage. Not the courage of a movie heroine, but the courage to exist, what May called ontological courage. It is the decision to be despite the threat of non-being. She internalized that the only way to combat fear was through action, even if that action was imperfect. She decided she needed an activity that connected her to concrete reality, that allowed her to see and feel the direct result of her effort. She didn't want a job that was just filling out spreadsheets. She wanted a craft that demanded total presence and was a mirror of her own reconstruction process. That's when the unexpected and surprising idea emerged: carpentry. Carpentry was not an expected female hobby. It was dirty, demanding strength, precision, and patience. But this choice was her most powerful symbolic act. She was literally deciding to build something new with her own hands, just as she was building a new life. The choice was a manifestation of her courage, a leap of faith in her own potential. This decision to embrace a practical craft resonated deeply with the concept of work as a means of self-realization. Carpentry would not only give her furniture, it would give her competence and authority over the material. She was exchanging emotional fragility for the solidity of wood. The hammer and saw would be her new tools of self-affirmation. For her audience, who understand the tedium of a purposeless job, the choice of carpentry is inspiring. It's a message that it's never too late to find a craft that calls us to be more than we were. Elara was moving from passivity, the wife, to creative activity, the builder. The choice of courage didn't eliminate Elara's fear. It simply put it in the back seat. She knew the first pieces would be crooked, that she would make mistakes and get hurt. But she had traded illusory security for creative risk. She was ready to take the money from the sale of the house and invest not in a refuge, but in a laboratory of herself. She was on the path to finally becoming the author and craftswoman of her own existence. So, did you already know about the benefits of terrible freedom? Did you know that anguish is the price of being the author of our own lives? Leave a comment, I want to know your opinion. Continuing. The first day of the carpentry course was a reality check. Elara, accustomed to elegant salons, was now in a rustic environment, full of sawdust and the smell of varnish. She was the only woman in a class of younger men, and her inexperience was glaring. But, for the first time in years, she felt completely present. Carpentry demanded full concentration, a second of distraction could cost a finger. This need for presence was the perfect antidote for her mind, previously flooded with ghosts of the past. The creative act of carpentry was her existential therapy. She was learning to deal with the resistance of matter. Wood doesn't yield, it needs to be respected, measured, and worked with precision. This reflected her own journey. Life doesn't yield, it needs to be confronted with effort and technique. Each hammer blow, each cut, was an act of intentionality. She was learning that control isn't about what happens, but about how you react and shape what you have in your hands. For her audience, this immersion in new learning shows that growth is not passive. It is active, often uncomfortable, and requires humility. Elara had to accept being a beginner again, which, for an adult, is an immense ego challenge. But the satisfaction of taking a rough board and transforming it into something functional was a much more solid reward than any praise from Kaio. This phase of construction was the opposite of her previous life, which was one of maintenance. Before, she maintained the house, now, she built. She was exchanging the role of consumer for that of producer. And this change of role was the essence of her reconnection with personal power. The beginning of the construction was painful, but fundamental. She was planting the seed of her self-sufficiency. The craft gave her a new language and a new kind of confidence, the confidence that comes from knowing you can take something broken, as she felt, and make it useful and beautiful again. That was the alchemy of her awakening. The path to self-sufficiency is not linear, and Elara soon encountered risk and frustration. The first few weeks were disastrous. She cut her finger with a chisel, made mistakes in measurements, and her pieces didn't fit together. She cried with anger and shame in the workshop, feeling the temptation to give up, to return to the easy comfort of dependence. This frustration, however, was a valuable teacher. Rollo May would say that the creative process always involves pain, as it is the confrontation between the idealized vision, the perfect table in your mind, and the stubborn reality, the wood that cracks. Elara was learning to deal with imperfection. She had to accept that error was not the end, but an essential part of creation. She was internalizing the courage to be imperfect. The physical pain from minor accidents brought her to the present with an intensity that denial would never allow. She was alive, and feeling the pain was proof of that. Each injury was a reminder that she was acting and, therefore, fully existing. She was no longer protected by a shell, she was exposed, vulnerable, and strong. For the audience, this phase is the most realistic. It's easy to dream of reinvention, but the reality of hard work is what separates desire from action. Elara shows us that building oneself is arduous. It's about picking up that bent nail, straightening it, and trying again. There are no shortcuts on the journey to freedom. Gradually, the frustration began to diminish, replaced by resilience. She learned to laugh at her own mistakes and to better plan her next step. The wood she damaged became firewood, but the experience became invaluable to her soul. Risk and frustration were the crucible where her new identity was being forged. With time and effort, the pieces began to fall into place. And the first chair Elara managed to assemble, solid and functional, was more than just a piece of furniture, it was her affirmation of self. It didn't matter if the instructor or her old friends praised her, the satisfaction came from the direct connection between her effort and the final object. She had created value from her own will. This is the pinnacle of existential authenticity. Elara was no longer seeking her self-worth in the reflection of Kaio's gaze or in the judgment of society. Her value was embedded in the very fiber of that wood. The chair was physical proof that she was capable. This ability was the new foundation of her self-esteem, a foundation that no one could take away. She began to feel the pride of the artisan. The freedom, which had once been terrifying, now seemed powerful. The power to create, to shape, and to be responsible for what one does. Each finished piece was a silent cry of independence, a final answer to the empty chair. For the audience, Elara's affirmation of being is a reminder that true wealth lies in a sense of competence. Money can be taken away, but the ability and conviction that you can build something can never be taken away. Elara was healing herself through creation. She was no longer just Kaio's ex-wife. She was the carpenter, the creator, the transformer. This new identity was intrinsic, not relational. She had become what Rollo May would call an authentic self, a being who defines herself through her own actions and values. As Elara delved deeper into her new craft, she realized that freedom didn't translate into constant happiness. Instead, it settled into a permanent creative tension. She was always oscillating between the fear of what might go wrong and the excitement of what she could build. This tension wasn't unpleasant, it was vital. Rollo May argues that authentic life resides in this tension, between the certainty of the past and the uncertainty of the future, between the anxiety of being and the desire to achieve. Elara lived on this border. She knew that at any moment she could fail, but this possibility was what kept her alert, creative, and moving. She was no longer seeking a static state of contentment, happiness. She sought the vitality of struggle. She was accepting that the process of becoming is the very purpose of life. Freedom was a heavy burden, yes, but it was a burden that made her stronger each day. This is a fundamental lesson for adult audiences: the obsessive pursuit of happiness can be paralyzing. Elara teaches us to embrace difficulty as an integral part of a meaningful life. The creative tension was proof that she was using her freedom, living responsibly and passionately. She had traded the superficial piece of the shell for the profound peace that comes only from effort. Freedom as tension was the new rhythm of her heart, a rhythm of struggle, creation, and acceptance. Okay, let's move on to the continuation of Elara and the terrible freedom story, but first I noticed you haven't liked this video yet. This is very important so that YouTube continues to show you our content and we can continue to help you. So, please like this video, it's free. With the confidence forged in wood, Elara took the next natural step, opening her workshop. Using the remaining household funds, she rented a small shed and transformed it into her refuge and laboratory. The workshop was not just a business, it was the material expression of her new self. She specialized in restoring antique furniture, giving new life to what had been discarded. This choice to restore was deeply symbolic. Elara was restoring herself by restoring the furniture. She saw in the scratches, the cracks, and the silent stories of the pieces her own journey. She was using her skill to honor the past, but transform it for the future. The studio became her space of authenticity. There, she was the sole authority. She set the prices, deadlines, and quality of the work. Approval didn't come from a boss or a husband, but from her own professional integrity. The opening of the studio was the sign that she had become the primary agent in her own life. For the audience, it's the realization that purpose can be found in meaningful, hands-on work. Elara's success wasn't in wealth, but in fulfillment. She was living May's truth: creative work is the means by which we affirm our existence and contribute to the world. The studio, with its smell of sawdust and oil, was her new shell, but this time, it was a shell she had built for herself, not one that had been imposed upon her. And that difference was everything. With the studio up and running, Elara didn't find the noisy, euphoric happiness that society so often promotes. Instead, she found deep peace. This peace wasn't the absence of problems, it was the conscious acceptance that anxiety and uncertainty are inherent to existence, what May calls the acceptance of existential anxiety. She knew that Kaio could cause trouble again, that a business could fail, or that she could get sick. But peace came from the certainty that she could endure anything, because she had the courage and competence to deal with reality. She had stopped fighting fear and started dancing with it. This peace was the result of integrity. She was aligned with her values and acting in accordance with them. She was living her truth, and that brings a calmness that no amount of money or luxury can buy. For the audience, Elara's deep peace is the true prize of freedom. It's the understanding that life is difficult, but that you are strong enough to face it. The world is circular, and one day, Kaio reappeared. Not the elegant and confident Kaio, but an aged man, with the weight of regret etched on his face. He had failed in his new ventures and was trying to rewrite history, seeking the comfort and stability he had abandoned. He sought out Elara in her studio, hoping to find the fragile victim he had left behind. But he found the artisan, covered in sawdust and authority, in command of her own space. He tried to ask for forgiveness, to justify his actions, resorting to the old dynamic of dependency. This return was Elara's ultimate test. How she reacted would determine whether she was truly free or merely recovering. Elara's response to Kaio was neither anger nor tears. It was surprisingly neutral. She listened calmly, without interrupting or judging. The anger and victimhood had died along with the old Elara. She didn't need him to be happy, nor did she need him to be a victim. This absence of revenge was the ultimate proof of her autonomy. She had transcended him. The wound of abandonment had become the scar that told the story of her courage, but no longer defined her. She was free from his emotional influence. For the audience, Elara's neutrality is the epitome of existential strength. True freedom is not about hating the oppressor, but about making the oppressor irrelevant. Seated at her workbench, calmly sanding a piece, Elara finally spoke. She didn't offer him forgiveness, but rather, transcendence. Looking at him, she said, "Thank you, Kaio. Your abandonment gave me the space to build myself. I am not happy because of freedom, I am who I am because of it." This phrase summarizes Rollo May's philosophy: the act of abandonment, the traumatic event, was transformed into a creative opportunity. She didn't blame him, she thanked him for being the catalyst he was. She transcended the role of victim to assume that of creator. Elara's freedom was not a state of contentment, it was the ability to transform pain into purpose. And that is the most powerful message for anyone who feels abandoned. Elara didn't return to Kaio. She remained in the studio, strong, calm, and working. She became the personification of the legacy of power. Her story is proof that true freedom, that terrible and powerful thing, is not the absence of problems. It is the ability to face anxiety, the terror of emptiness, and yet act, the power of will, to create one's own meaning. Elara never found utopian happiness, but she found something far more valuable, the integrity of being. She was fully alive. So, now that you know Elara's story, did you already know that freedom requires the courage to be and that anguish is the price of our authorship? Leave a comment. If you already knew this story or know someone who needs it, share this video. And don't forget to check out the next videos appearing on your screen now. Thank you for watching this far and immersing yourself in the intensity of freedom with us. Remember, the power to build yourself up is always greater than the pain of abandonment. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving future content that will help you find that same courage. Until the next video.